But at the core of Canadian and American identity is a very big lie. And we learn how to adapt to this lie. Most people understanding of where they are and understanding of history, it's like they went to a play, but in the third act, and they leave before the final curtain.
You've created one of the best documentaries in pro wrestling.
No, I created one of the best documentaries, period. Don't say in pro wrestling. That's what we're living in now. A society run by the battle of the billionaire. They run the society, and then between them, they fight. But there's a fiction, which is they have a political theater. There's this great phrase from Shakespeare. All the world is a stage, and all the men and women merely players on it. The vast majority of our news, of our academics, of people that study history and stuff, all they focus on is the players. They don't want to ask who owns the stage. People say, how come we've never seen a democracy, a socialist democracy? The answer is simple. Excuse me for swearing. Because you fucks killed anyone that tried it. People like Schmidt, who used to run Google, he goes on and on warning of the existential threat of AI. And he's one of the biggest investors in militarized AI. It's very clear what's happening. Elon Musk said it really well about Twitter. Somebody asked him in one of these sessions he does, do you censor people? He says, we don't have to do that. We just limit reach.
This is a conversation with Paul J. He's a filmmaker popularly known for the documentaries Hitman Heart, Wrestling with Shadows, and Return to Kandahar, and a journalist who was the former producer of the debate programs Counterspin and Face Off on CBC, and the founder of independent media platforms like the Real News Network and theAnalysis-news. In this conversation, we talk about his journey, his childhood, his motivations. We talk about the problems in mainstream media, why he left it and started independent media platforms. We talk about the power of films and documentaries and how much impact they have in comparison to the daily news. We also explore the history of the Cold War, the current state of geopolitics, and how we can prevent a nuclear war. So all the light stuff. These are the type of conversations that I want to have. 1-2 hour discussions about the laws of nature, quantum computing, cognitive science, Jungian psychology, geopolitics, journalism, rationality. This is my idea of a raging Friday night, but this is not what the algorithm thinks is exciting. If I really want to just create a channel that gets a lot of views, I should be making meme videos or compilations or making dance videos. But I do think these conversations are of value, but this model is not sustainable. The algorithm will never push it. So if you really want this project to continue, you can either consider making a donation, buy super thanks, become a Patreon donor, or you can just share these episodes, because these external links and clicks and shares, they really help videos push past those barriers that are set by the algorithm that looks at a 2-hour discussion about Jungian psychology and does it consider it exciting enough for the layman. So if you like this episode, only if you like it, by the end of this episode, please consider sharing it around. And now, it's no time.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
In the About Us section of the Analysis-news website, there's a small paragraph that talks about your mission, which says, we take on important news stories as a way into a deeper examination of the economic, social, and political forces that drive important events. Our aim is to reveal the economic relationships that are the foundation of political and social struggle. We know the world can only be understood in the process of changing it. You've lived a colorful life, and that's understating it. You've created 2 independent news networks. You've hosted debate programs on CBC. You've worked as a truck driver. You fixed railroad cars. You've created award-winning documentaries. And I want to cover all of that. But before we do that, I just have to know why. Why do you do this, Paul J? What's the motivation? Why this hunger to both understand and change the world? Where does this drive come from?
It's a good question, because it's not an answer I really fully understand. I grew up in a left-wing household.
You were a red diaper baby, as you said.
Yeah, it was. And my father, during the war, he deliberately joined the Canadian Air Force in 1939 explicitly to fight fascism. And he knew that's why he was joining. He joined before there was any draft. He was quite political, left-wing, grew up in Montreal, and was in this crazy, dangerous section of Canadian Bomber Command attached to the Royal Air Force out of the UK. And they used to pick the left-wing flyers to do the most dangerous missions because they actually would do the mission. Most of the ordinary flyers wanted to get the hell out alive, but the left-wingers had a kind of anti-fascist consciousness. And so my father's section, they used to drop supplies and people to the partisans in France. And they, in a big bomber, they'd go off with a bombing mission headed to Germany, and then his plane would leave and go down into France, drop a person or supplies, and then get the hell out without getting shot down. So I grew up with that and knowing that about him, even though he didn't talk a lot about it, which I regret, because I would have gotten more out of him, because he died when I was 14, so I never got a chance to really get to know him as an adult. My mother was also lefty. She'd gone to Hollywood and got involved around the Hollywood 10, and they left the U.S. because of McCarthyism. And so they left around 1950 or so. On the other hand, it's not like they ever propagandized me. Quite the contrary. You know, little hints. But I didn't grow up with an internalized Cold War mentality, which most people I knew did. And certainly most people today still do. And we can talk about that more later. But the very deliberate creation of a very false narrative of history has created this same thing we see today, which is a complete exaggeration of the threat to justify militarization of the economy. But I didn't grow up in that kind of household. There's a very famous journalist that was working in the 50s into the 60s called I.F. Stone, left-wing, muckraking kind of guy. You know, I'd come home from lunch and my mother would read me the I.F. Stone newsletter. But again, it wasn't a lot. But when we talk about why we do things, you're really talking about a person's identity. And usually when people answer that question, it starts with the word I or my. My father. I did this. This happened to me. I grew up, but very little about the society we grow up in. And at the core, certainly of an American and a Canadian identity, and I grew up in Canada, but I'm a dual citizen. I've lived in the US quite a bit. But mostly I grew up in Canada. But at the core of Canadian and American identity is a very big lie. And we learn how to adapt to this lie. And the lie is, in 1867, Canada was formed. This is the Canadian lie. I can give you the American version. And they built railroads, and la-di-da, we have this democracy and so on. We know this land was stolen. We know this land was conquered and that Canada came about as a result of a genocide. Now, it was worse in the U.S., and for economic reasons, not because Canadians have better, more moral DNA, not at all. There's no such thing anyway. But the economy of the colonization of Canada for many centuries was primarily based around the fur trade. And Hudson's Bay Company was, Canada and the United States were settled by corporations. I mean, this corporate rule of North America begins on day one of European civilization. The Hudson's Bay Company, like in India, the
East India Company.
East India Company. Well, same thing here. Hudson's Bay got the franchise for settling the western part of Canada. I'm sorry, I can't remember who got more the eastern, but Quebec was already here. Quebec existed for almost 400 or 500 years before the British settled. But here, fur trade, because it was the main economy for a long time, required trade with the indigenous people. So there wasn't the same slaughter for a long time, where in the US, it was almost from day one about land. And to get land for agriculture and settlement and creating towns and so on, you have to get the indigenous people the hell out. So in the US, driving indigenous people further and further west, and then eventually killing and slaughtering in the millions, deliberately, and they did some of this in Canada too, deliberately infecting blankets with smallpox and things like this. But we learn in Canada and the US, we learn to know this history and then forget about it. Even now in Canada, there's every public event now practically. I have kids at school. Every day begins with something they call the land acknowledgement. And it goes like, we acknowledge we are on the land, and then they name the list of tribes depending where you are. And then it ends. And then you get on with life. Well, if you acknowledge this as indigenous land, then how about doing something about it? Because the indigenous people of Canada and the US are still suffering the consequences of that genocide. In this lovely, supposed liberal democracy of Canada, the majority of Native people live in utter poverty, reservations where the kids have nothing to do but smell glue. If not the highest suicide rate in the world, one of the highest suicide rates. But we learn from early childhood how to compartmentalize that we are living on stolen land. And that's the beginning of a kind of very false consciousness. So when someone talks about who they are, what their identity is, what motivates them, the narrative of the society, the official narrative, is very rarely looked at objectively, critically. Because most people, their consciousness and identity is just, what they grew up in and what they made of it. There's a great quote from Walter Lippmann, who was a famous American journalist, even advised the Americans on the Versailles Treaty and so on. But he had a great quote. He said, most people understanding of where they are and understanding of history, it's like they went to a play, but in the third act, and they leave before the final curtain.
Right.
They don't know how they got there. So how do you answer the question, what motivates you and who you are, if you don't know how you got here? And you can't talk about how did I get here without knowing how your society got here. And that's not just a question in Canada of what happened to indigenous people and so on. In the United States, there's another very, very important denial. And that the society, first of all, was based on indentured labor. Before there was black slavery, the majority of settlers in the United States that came from England or it came from Holland, New York was more the Dutch, were indentured. They were essentially contracted slaves, sometimes for up to 13 to 14 years before they could get released from their contracts. And while they were in the indentured contract, they had no rights. They were essentially slaves. And if they tried to escape, they used other sort of people that had served out their contract and were now quote unquote free. They would create militias to go capture these white European indentured people and make them go back to their contracted places of work. But the white indentured labor was rebellious. They didn't want to be in these contracts. And eventually, after some time, they started to realize it'd be a hell of a lot better to have outright black slaves and use the white workers and split them, because there was a rebellion in, I'm terrible on the dates, but probably in the late 1700s. There's an actual rebellion of black slaves with white indentured workers who together rise up against slavery and against indenturedness. And that scared the hell out of the American elites. So they started really pushing black slave labor. This is the development of the cotton plantations. People don't get how significant the cotton plantations were. By the 1840s, 1850s, prior to the Civil War, cotton economy, slave economy, was bigger than all the rest of the economy. Banks, railroads.
Combined.
And it was the cotton that fueled the textile trade of England and northern United States. Anyway, what I'm getting at is personal identity. You grew up in a society that's in denial about all of this, that never wants to talk about it. Yeah, sure, you learned there was slavery in the United States, but that was then, this is now. Well, no, the consequences of slavery exist today. I mean, I lived in Baltimore for 8-9 years. You want to see the consequences of slavery, you go to inner cities like Baltimore, where unemployment amongst youth is at 50 and 60%. There's sections of the city where practically every single male has been in and out of prison. Thousands of kids born already drug addicted, in extreme poverty. And why? Because all the institutions, because the majority of the black working class is desperate for work. And so they work for the lowest wages. Anyway, all these issues you can explore more in detail. But my point is, if someone wants to talk about motivation, you have to understand the society we're born in. So I was kind of lucky. I didn't grow up in a Cold War household. Not uber political, not super political, but not Cold War. But when I was about, 8 or 9, and I don't know, some of this is DNA even, I think. I can't quite explain it. But I read an article when I was 8 or 9 years old. There was a famine in northern Canada. And literally, in those days, they would call the people Eskimos. Now, Inuit. And there was a famine, and hundreds and even thousands of people were dying in northern Canada of lack of food. And it was a shock to me when I read it in the newspaper. And I grew up reading newspapers. From the time I could read, I read newspapers. So I wrote Prime Minister Diefenbaker a letter. And it really was, I think, my own initiative. I said, why aren't you doing anything about the famine in the North? And I get this bullshit letter back from some aide of Diefenbaker who says, we're so pleased that you're concerned about these issues. You should go to your local church and volunteer to help. I mean, that was part of my real beginning of my political consciousness, because I knew what bullshit that answer was. What motivates me? What motivates me is I understand that what's in my personal interest is a better world. I don't want to live in a world that's about where human civilization is about to end because of climate crisis. I don't want to live in a world that's on the brink of nuclear war. I don't want to live in a world where probably the majority of people live in poverty and starvation. And I see my interest in that. It's not, I don't consider it altruistic. I don't see it, I do it for others. I see in my own interest. And I guess in a word, I learned fairly early on, what makes me happy is to live a meaningful life. And I always searching for what's the most meaningful thing I can do. Whenever I have veered off that path, to make a film just to make some money, or there's a great line from Marx. He says, I don't live for money, but I need money to live. Well, for me, you need money to do the kind of work I want to do. So I'm not naive about it. But I never made pursuit of money or a career my objective, because anytime I tried it, it didn't actually make me very happy. What made me happy was trying to change the world for the better. So I do it. I mean, I do my best to do it.
I love the answer because, in a way, it's this historical materialist view of your motivations, how the social, political forces end up shaping who you are and what drives you. Like you mentioned, you were a red diaper baby, grew up under the wave of McCarthyism in the United States, and your parents decided to move from America to Canada when America started using the excuse of the Cold War to go after the unions. There was a House of Un-American Activities. The slogan back then was better dead than red. And you've seen all of this. You've seen this, and all of that seeps into your motivations. Interestingly, when I think you were 11 or 13, at that point, you witnessed how close we came to nuclear war, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and possibly the closest we've ever come. And you decided to drop out of school because you thought, I'm not going to make it till the age of 20. So it's quite interesting how all of these things seep into making who you are and your motivations. I want to jump ahead in the chronology of your life and talk about your work in media first, and then we'll come back. We'll talk about filmmaking and documentaries as well. You were the executive producer of the debate programs Counterspin and Face Off on CBC. And you've said one of the turning points in your life was 9/11, which was then immediately followed by the War on Terror and the Iraq War, at which point you started questioning the integrity of the media, its function, what it said it stood for, and then what it actually stood for. So take me back to those times. What were some of the gaping holes in mainstream media that made you want to leave it?
Well, first of all, my rupture with mainstream media started when I wrote that letter to Diefenbaker.
Okay.
So when I was about 8 years old.
Okay.
Long before 9/11. 9/11 was no surprise to me. It was not a turning point. I mean, not like I was expecting it, but it didn't. It wasn't sort of out of my understanding of the world why it happened and what took place afterwards. I was never really part of mainstream media, ever, even though the whole thing was bizarre, honestly. Counterspin was a debate show. So I'm always looking as a filmmaker for stories to make a film about. And it has to be meaningful to me. But I'm watching in 1992, I guess it is, there's a National Hockey League, NHL players strike.
Yeah.
And so they had a guest on. He's the president of the NHL Owners Association. I forget his name.
John Ziegler. And then Bob Goodenow.
Yeah, how do you know that? Oh my God. You did your research. Anyway, so Ziegler's on and they interview Ziegler and he defends the owners. And at the end of the interview, I say, I'm with the owners. Right. Everything he said makes perfect sense to me. Then a couple of days later, they interview Bob Goodenow, who was the head of the Players Association. And everything he said made sense to me. I said, okay, I'm with the Players Association. So then it hit me, unless the interviewer didn't know enough to pierce either of them. And I needed to hear them confront each other. And I said, well, we need this for politics. You need a legitimate debate, smart, clever, and a host that can make it, not allow it to become propagandistic or just talking points. So eventually Ron and I pitched it to CBC News World, which was their news cable channel, and they said yes. And so for 10 years, we had a daily, the debate show for the country, and we got to shape a lot of the political discourse in the country, because anyone that was at all political paid attention to it, 5 nights a week. It was a prime time at 8 o'clock and repeated again at 11 o'clock. So we had a lot of exposure. But that's as close as I got to being part of mainstream media, because I wouldn't even allow our office. It was an independent production. Let me start with that. It wasn't a CBC production. We licensed the show to CBC. We shot it at CBC. But I made sure our offices weren't in the building. We had our own offices. I didn't want to be part of even though it's a public broadcaster, I didn't want to be part of that corporate culture. So I was never in mainstream media, even though I produced a mainstream media show. But what the debate show taught me is we would do debates, like, for example, in the lead up to the Iraq War. We would have debate after debate about, are there weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? And we would have somebody, defending the American side. A lot of American neocon guests we would get on, even people like Frank Gaffney. I mean, the far right, as long as they were smart, and lots of the far right are quite smart. And we'd have, a real debate about it. But show after show, it became incredibly clear there was zero evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, like zero. And then the next night, we'd have a weapons inspector on our show on a Monday night, clearly exposing this fact. The next night on CBC News, nothing, no follow-up. That would happen story after story, where we would really break news in the debate. But the national news that's right next to us where we shot, through one door, we're in the national newsroom. They paid zero attention to what we were doing. Same thing happened after 9/11, well after 9/11, about 5-6 years after 9/11. I interviewed Senator Bob Graham. Senator Bob Graham was the governor of Florida, the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, total intelligence insider, and became the co-chair of the Joint Congressional Investigation into 9/11. And he told me on camera over the course of several interviews that not only did Bush Cheney know something was coming, but they facilitated it. Facilitated it, his words. And he gave me examples of how they facilitated the 9/11 attacks. The last time I interviewed him, he was the most explicit about it. And I sent an email to every news organization of any significance in North America. And I wrote, I've got these interviews with Bob Graham. I just did a recent one with him. Here's what he told me. And I said, I can't tell you whether he's right. I wasn't in the White House. I can't say Cheney said this or said that. But given who Bob Graham is, isn't this a news story? And I will give you my interview with him for free. All you got to do is run it and credit me. I didn't get one answer. Not a single answer from any news organization to have access to my interview. Now, in retrospect, it might be a mistake I offered it for free. If I'd offered to sell it, they might have. They don't like when things are free. Then they say you have an agenda. And if you have an agenda, we can't deal with you. You have to be in it for the money. So my demarcation or rupture with mainstream media just got more and more as I got older, as I understood it better. But 9/11 wasn't the turning point for me. It just was a place where I could see more than usual, significantly more than usual, how the media was absolutely terrified to go outside certain boundaries. Dan Rather said something very interesting after the Iraq war began, 4 or 5, 6 months, the former host of CBS News. He said it to BBC interviewer. He wouldn't say this in the US. He said, being in a American newsroom after 9/11 and the beginning of the Iraq war was like being a trader in a South African township and have a flaming tire of patriotism put around your neck. It's Dan Rather, host of the CBS News. It was a new McCarthyism. So what I understood better after 9/11 and the Iraq war is how profoundly terrified journalists were to say what they knew. And which is why, I started an independent thing. But the problem with the independent thing is they don't get big enough. At least I didn't know how to get it big enough.
Let's explore that, because you started 2 independent platforms, the Real News Network initially, now theAnalysis-news. And you've said some of the early inspirations for this was, one, when you visited Afghanistan, you were quite taken by how much education had regressed in the country after the war. You came across truck drivers who didn't know where Canada was. They thought it was next to Germany. You met young boys who couldn't tell you their age because they didn't know how to count. And the other inspiration was when you sat down to write the script for a movie set in 2020, and you were quite scared of just imagining that future, so you wanted to try and change it. So you created these independent platforms, and you created them on what you called a new economic model that was based on a triple no policy: no government funding, no corporate funding, no advertising. When it comes to media, is that a sustainable model in the long run? I'm asking for a friend because personally as well, I've tried to run this project on no advertisers. I've asked for donations, but honestly, it's not a sustainable model for me. And it's very soon I have to make a decision between either I get advertisers or I capitulate and I shut the project down completely. So do you think this new economic model can work in media?
I think some people are making a subscription model work, on Substack particularly. I was able to get both of the models I got going, but to a large extent based on donations that were bigger than just the 10 or 20 bucks a month. To create something at the scale I was hoping to create, we could never have done it without bigger donors. Now, the bigger donors were very progressive. They supported the mission. and mostly didn't affect what we did. But it's not very sustainable because it's so dependent on the goodwill of a few big donors. It's possible. I mean, there are people that seem to be making it work now to some extent. I think it's mostly the subscription model that seems to be driving it more than donations. But the analysis is still going. We publish something once a week, but it's very marginal. It's so small. And so I came from having big platforms. My films were on all major networks, from CBC to BBC to Arte, the States, A&E, Discovery, Turner. I mean, I came from having mainstream platforms, but I couldn't do the more direct political stuff I wanted. Now, the film I'm doing now is funded all through donation and philanthropy. And I've raised a good budget, significant budget. But I think it's the topic. It's not a model for a regular news thing. It wouldn't work for an interview thing like I was doing before. It's because it's called How to Stop a Nuclear War. And it's narrated by Emma Thompson. And we're likely to have mainstream impact. It's going to be released in theaters, and we're going to raise more money to make a lot of noise about it. So I was able, because you put all these ingredients together. But again, it's not a model for a regular show. I can't answer the question really other than to say I couldn't do it. The model, the way I did it, required a few big donors, and in the long run, it's not a very good way to go.
Is that why you left the Real News Network? There was a misalignment in the vision moving forward?
There are a lot of reasons for it. But I would say my primary reason was I thought it had plateaued. Right in the beginning, I said, go big or go home.
The concept had plateaued or the network itself?
Network. Well, both. When I started it, the vision was to go big. We would become a rival of mainstream stuff. I mean, not as big, but big. And it didn't get there. And there were other platforms, like, for example, Democracy Now! Is a much bigger platform than we ever had. So it wasn't that there were some things that had bigger platforms. But when I said go big or go home, there were a lot of things going on at the time, but fundamental thing was, I don't think we were going to get any bigger. I had hoped when we were in Baltimore, we'd be able to really dig in to Baltimore itself and get a kind of a real following in Baltimore. And we did some. Again, didn't get to the scale I would have hoped. There are other reasons too, but in terms of my personal motivation for wanting to go was that. Now, when I started the analysis, I wanted to keep my hand in, but I knew I'd be working on the nuclear war film. And I started that almost the same time I started the analysis. So the analysis kept my hand in. It gave me a way to interview and talk and say stuff about what's going on. But I didn't have any expectations that it would get big. I was quite fine. And now, and for a while, it was actually bigger than I expected. And then it's very interesting. I did a story on the real lead up to the January 6th events, the storming of Congress, the Trump thing. And YouTube took it down. And everything in it was mainstream news. I had just connected the dots in a way others hadn't. And somebody didn't like it. And I mean, the gist of it really quickly was that there was a real coup attempt, and it wasn't January 6th. It was the lead up to January 6th. And there was an attempt by a faction of the military to seize ballot boxes and declare martial law. They had an actual PowerPoint that was actually turned over to the Congressional Investigation Committee that took place later. Almost no one's ever heard of any of this, even though it was like what happens in these kinds of things is the Washington Post will do a story, and that's it, move on. And nobody follows up on it. You know, on January 4th, I might as well tell this story. It's a good story. So on January 4th, 10 former secretaries of defense have an op-ed in the Washington Post. This is 2 days before the events of the storming of Capitol Hill, right? Warning the military to stay out of the elections. 10 former secretaries of defense in a joint op-ed in the Washington Post. On the same day, Admiral Stavridis, who's the former Supreme Commander of NATO, same day has an article in Time magazine, Time magazine, where he supports the letter from the 10 former secretaries of defense. He also says they're planning a coup. And he warns the military to stay out, and he says he understands. He says the phone call from Trump to the Secretary of State in Georgia saying, give me X thousand votes, that went public, that phone call. He says a chill must have gone down the spine of these secretaries of defense because it was clear Trump was planning a coup and was trying to manipulate the election outcome. January 4th, 2 days before the 6th, the Financial Times has an editorial, an editorial from the editorial board that ends with saying, as bizarre as it seems, it's close to exact quote, a coup is in progress in the United States. Financial Times, 2 days before all the shit hits the fan. So I do a story about this weeks later, and you know, it's very clear what's happening, and other people have written about it, but Elon Musk said it really well about Twitter. Somebody asked him in one of these sessions he does, do you censor people on Twitter? Before it was called X. And he says, oh, we don't have to do that. We just limit reach. So they just suppress you so nobody knows it's there. And then we found out from the Twitter files that Taibbi got hold of, maybe from Musk, I don't know. But the FBI was directly working on algorithms with Twitter to suppress certain people. And I'm absolutely convinced that we got targeted after January 6th. So anyway, from a personal point of view, I do what I can on the analysis and try to give a perspective that you don't find too many other places. But I mostly focused on making the film.
This is no time. If you liked what you just watched or listened to, then please consider supporting this project. You can subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, rate 5 stars in Apple Podcasts.